is that we're going to talk about the smallest functional piece of your kidney, which is the nephron. So in our class on Tuesday, we talked about your entire excretory system, what all the pieces were. That's where we had kidney, bladder, ureter, urethra. Then we had your kidney itself, where we talked about the sections of your kidney, like how the cortex, which means bark, is the outside. The medulla, which means middle, is in the middle. And now we're focusing just on the nephron. Now, to remind you where the nephron is, I'm just going to back up to the last picture that we looked at. I drew a really crude nephron the other day, and I showed you how a large part of the nephron is in the cortex, but then a little piece of it dips down into the medulla. And so we'll talk about that today when we're talking about the anatomy of your nephrons. So the first slide that I have are all of the pieces that are talking about blood vessels. Now, technically, the blood vessels themselves are not part of the nephron. They surround it, but because they're so integral to the way that your kidney functions, they're still part of your kidney. They're not officially part of the nephron. They're around the nephron. So when we look at this diagram, you'll see, first of all, some blood vessels that we've already named coming into your kidney or coming towards the nephron. So notice here you have these two blood vessels. Now the darker colored one is the one that goes into this sort of ball right here. And we'll see in a minute that that's how I can identify that that darker colored one is the artery. The other vessel is the vein, and I know that because it's coming down from the bottom here. And so the direction of blood flow on this picture would be like this. So blood is flowing in through the artery. It's going to flow all the way around, and it's going to come out through the vein. Now, what I'll recommend to you is after we've labeled things, it might be worth your while to do a little bit of coloring on this particular diagram because there's so many pieces that overlap each other. And if you add at least one color, sometimes it's easier to visualize which thing is part of a blood vessel and which thing is part of a tube. But I'm going to suggest that you don't do that right away until you can see what all the parts are, and then you can decide which color you want to use. So we're going to focus on this artery, because that is how blood is coming in towards the nephron. The first thing that we really have to label will be this little guy right here. Now, since it's a branch off of an artery, it's not the official artery, it's not your full renal artery, it's a piece of one, it is called your afferent arteriole. An arteriole is a branch off of an artery. And what's the function of your afferent arteriole? Well, it brings blood into something called the glomerulus, which I will define second. Now, the second thing that has to do with blood is the glomerulus. It's the ball that I alluded to earlier. So I labeled it number 2. And what does the glomerulus do? Well, it has a pretty important function. It filters your blood. So this is the spot where we decide what gets from your blood into your urine and what does not. So I'm going to make a little comment here. If there's there's something in your urine that's not supposed to be there, best chance guess, your glomerulus is broken. Something damaged it, something tore a hole in it, something caused one of the fenestrations to become larger. But the glomerulus is usually the culprit if there is a substance in urine that shouldn't be. Now, it's not a 100% rule. I'm just telling you, if you were stuck and you had to guess, this is probably the culprit. So because it's filtering your blood, what it's doing is it's allowing a portion of the plasma to escape. And so maybe we'll define what plasma means. In your blood, you have two parts, basically. You have the part that has cells and the part that's basically water. The water part is the plasma part. So when we say plasma, we mean water and things that are dissolved in water. It is supposed to retain red blood cells and large proteins. So if you have red blood cells in your urine, something is wrong in the glomerulus because it is not supposed to let them through. If you have proteins in your urine, something has happened to the glomerulus. It's not supposed to let them through. Now, one of the questions that you'll see that I enjoy asking would be a numeric response type question. Hey, I found this in someone's urine. What's wrong with them? That would be something that I would ask. It's a very typical question. It might be today, although it might not be because I don't think we'll have that much time today. But at some point, we will do some questions out of your textbook, and one of them will ask this exact thing. Here's 4 people. They each have something weird in their urine. What part is broken, or what thing has caused this? Now, the plasma, so the liquid part of your blood that is leaving your blood and going into the nephron, is now called the filtrate because it's what got filtered. Now the idea with the glomerulus, in terms of its appearance, the glomerulus has tiny pores. It kind of looks like that. If you were to look at it up close, crisscrossy. So it has these tiny little pores that only allow small molecules to leave your blood and go into the filtrate. The technical word for that is a fenestrated capillary. You don't have to call it that. That's just what it's called when it's set up like this. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions at all about the glomerulus? So next, we have the efferent arteriole. Now, the efferent arteriole doesn't have a label sticking out of it on your picture. I'm just going to add one. The blood that comes out of the glomerulus is the efferent arteriole. Now, you'll recognize the efferent arteriole because it is the one that starts branching off, and it forms what we call the capillary net. You have several types of blood vessels, arteries and veins, and I discussed with you that it determines which way the blood is going, but there has to be something connecting these arteries and veins. So anytime an artery brings blood towards an organ or to some cells, it'll always eventually branch off into capillaries. Capillaries are thin blood vessels that allow diffusion really easily, and so they're necessary so that transport can happen in and out of your blood. So if I were to follow this little picture, I'm just going to highlight the blood vessels here. So the blood vessels start branching off. They start wrapping around, and they make what looks like a little net all around the tubes that you see here. So it's called the capillary net because it really does look like a little net all the way around the nephron. So we'll call number 4 the capillary net, and it's labeled right here. The capillary net, like I mentioned, surrounds your nephron and is there to absorb things. It has really thin walls, and so things can transport, things can move between your blood and your nephron much more easily through a capillary than through an artery, which has really thick walls and is very muscular. Now I'm just going to make one more comment about blood vessels. You'll notice that these two things are almost exactly the same except for the first letter. One of them is called afferent, one of them is called efferent. These are medical terminology words for describing the direction of blood flow. Afferent, I like to associate with the word arrives. It is bringing something to that structure. So the afferent arteriole brings blood to the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole, I'd like to associate with the word exit, E and exit. It exits the structure and takes blood away from it. Now, afferent and efferent are relative words. They have to be used when you're describing the position of a structure compared to blood flow. One particular blood vessel is not necessarily always an afferent one. It depends which structure we're talking about. This is the only spot that we're going to use those terms, whether blood is coming in or coming out of the glomerulus. The key thing that I want you to notice is that the efferent arteriole has filtered blood in it. The afferent arteriole does not have filtered blood. It hasn't gone through the glomerulus yet. The efferent arteriole has blood that has been filtered. Things have been removed from blood. Now, in terms of blood vessels, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask about blood vessels? So then we're going to talk about the other structures on this diagram that are kind of between all of the blood vessels, which are the actual structures of the nephron. So we're still on the same diagram, and we're going to talk about now where the filtrate goes. So what we're going to talk about next highlights the path of the filtrate, which is essentially the urine that you are going to produce. I would ask this question, what's the path of urine, or what's the path of the filtrate? It would make an excellent numeric response question for me to give you some of these structures and ask you to put them in order. What happens at the beginning, what happens at the end. So these will be in order of where the filtrate is going, more or less. Now the first structure that we'll talk about is Bowman's capsule. On your diagram, it's this line right here. It's sort of a little cup-shaped structure that surrounds the glomerulus. So that is Bowman's capsule. So what is its job? It collects the filtered plasma, so the filtrate, from the glomerulus. This is the first spot that what will eventually be your urine is actually inside a tube in your kidney instead of in your blood. This is the transfer point. So if I ask a path of filtrate or a path of urine question, Bowman's capsule is always the starting point. It's always number 1. Now if I follow where Bowman's capsule is attached, I will meet the proximal convoluted tubule, which is kind of a long name. It is very often referred to as PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. It's called proximal because proximal means close. So the proximal convoluted tubule is the one that's closer. You'll see the other one is called the distal convoluted tubule. That's because it's farther away. Convoluted is discussing its shape, the fact that it's all bendy and windy. So on the diagram, the proximal convoluted tubule starts at Bowman's capsule and does a pretty awesome little windy bit. So this is the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, what is its job? It collects the filtrate from Bowman's capsule, so it travels through this tube. And in this particular spot, ions, nutrients, and water are removed. So here's what happens. Basically, your blood gets filtered, but a bunch of stuff that your body wants to keep gets filtered along with it. So the first section of this tubule is to remove all of these desirable substances and move them back into the blood. So this is where things that I want to keep, things like glucose, things like water, are taken out of the filtrate and put back into the blood so your body can keep them. Now, does this always work properly? Of course not. Sometimes you will have too much glucose in your blood, and that's usually a signal that someone is diabetic because not enough of it can be removed. Sometimes you might have too much sodium. Sometimes you might have too much water even. And so this is a spot that could be affected if these desirable substances are not taken out of the filtrate and put back into your blood. Now this tubule continues along down its path that I'm going to try to draw here. Boop, 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 boop. Comes back up again. And that loop part we'll talk about separately. So this is called the loop of Henle. It's on my next page because it has its own separate little function. But if I was putting them in order, the third thing is the loop of Henle, which is that black piece. And I'll describe it on the next slide when we talk about sodium and water a bit more. The next piece is the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule is the one that's at the end. So you'll be able to recognize it because it's attached to the long branch on the side, but that's the distal convoluted tubule. It's called distal because it's farther away from Bowman's capsule. It's called convoluted because of its shape, and it's called a tubule because it's a tube. You could abbreviate this one DCT. Now this is the last section of the nephron before we're going to go into the spot where all of the urine is collected. It makes the final adjustment to water. So what we'll see is that this is a spot that a hormone called ADH has its role. Now this hormone increases the permeability of the distal convoluted tubule, so the DCT, to water, meaning that more water travels out, back into your blood, back into the capillary net. Now we will talk about some specifics about this particular hormone, ADH. It's a little bit further on in the notes when we talk about how things are controlled and how homeostasis is maintained. But I'm just going to write the word homeostasis here so that you are already thinking, hey, when she asks us about homeostasis on this quest, I know I should probably talk about this hormone ADH and how it affects water. Now, is there anything that anyone would like to ask about any of those pieces? Bowman's capsule or the proximal or distal convoluted tubule? Now, the reason, you might ask, that I talk about these pieces all together and I skip over that loop of Henle piece is because if you look at the diagram, Bowman's capsule, the PCT, and the DCT are all completely in the cortex of the kidney. So if I was to identify which section of the kidney I was in, I would see that all of those structures we just talked about, because they're at the top, are all in the cortex. And then we'll talk about the structures that dip into the medulla on their own separate sheet. All right, so we just have one more slide where we'll talk about the other two pieces of the nephron, the two pieces that dip down into the medulla. Is anyone still writing? I see a couple people still writing things, so I'll just stop and wait for a second. Okay. So this is our last one. We just have two more pieces to discuss. And I'm just going to remind you that we are in the medulla now. So we're in not the outside layer of the kidney, but now we've dipped down into that middle layer that's darker colored, not just on pictures, but as you will see tomorrow, because I definitely have kidneys in my fridge at my house, when we dissect our kidneys, the color really is visibly different. So the medulla is darker and the cortex is lighter. And there's a really good reason for that. If you take a look at the way the blood vessels are set up, the majority of the capillary net is in the medulla. That plus the concentration is different there as well. So we just have these two structures, the loop of Henle. So the loop of Henle is the piece of tube that dips down and makes literally a loop shape. So what does the loop of Henle do? Well, like I already mentioned, it extends from the renal cortex into the medulla. So this is the part of the nephron that is not on the outside but has dipped down into the middle. Now what's different? Visibly, of course, I said the cortex is lighter and the medulla is darker. But another thing as we get down into the bottom of the loop of Henle is that it's saltier. So what happens in your kidneys, and this is a place where you might recognize salt is not all bad. You actually require some of this so that your kidneys can function properly. But there is the active transport of sodium. That means that your body is using ATP to force sodium to leave the filtrate, so to leave your urine, and go back into the bloodstream. The reason that I need to do this is it helps to draw out water. Now you might remember if you took Science 10 recently talking about words like hypertonic and hypotonic. If you took it a while ago, you might be like, what? I've never learned that in my entire life. But one of the ideas that I know you probably heard at some point was that you should not drink salt water. If you were to drink salt water when you were shipwrecked, you would die much faster than if you drank no water. And it's because salt attracts water. Water naturally likes to move to where salt concentration is high. That's what osmosis is, water moving towards high concentrations. So if I put lots of sodium outside of the filtrate, then water will leave as well. So here are some things. The ascending loop of Henle is impermeable to water. So that is the part that is going upwards. In that particular spot, sodium is being transported, but water is not anymore. This keeps the central part of your kidneys salty all the time, so that they are constantly a higher concentration, so that water is constantly attracted there. So sodium is being transported still. The result, your urine is hypotonic compared to the medulla, which is hypertonic. Hypo means less concentrated. Hypertonic means more concentrated. So the next time someone says to you, why are you putting salt on your food? That is so bad for you. You will say, no, person that I don't know at A&W. I need salt to survive. Maybe you should have taken bio in high school. And I'm saying that because that is a real true thing that happened to me in my personal life. When I was in high school, I don't know, that's what we did. We went to A&W, you bought one coffee, you could refill it like 75 times, and it cost 50 cents. This is in, 100 years ago in the olden days. And you could just sit around and loiter there for no apparent reason. So that's where we went to do homework. And people would just start talking to you and comment on what you were doing. One time a man, this is for Bio 30, we were talking about my reproductive notes in Bio 30 when I was in high school, and then a man leaned over and told us about his wife's birth process in detail, and then I stopped going to A&W for a while after that. It was creepy. Anyways, the idea is that you require sodium. The other thing you require sodium for is every single nerve impulse that ever happens in your body is based on sodium. So if someone tells you don't eat salt, say, beat it, I need some salt, I would die without it. Now lastly, the collecting duct. The collecting duct is this guy over here. It's full of little branchy looking tubes. The collecting duct is attached to more than one nephron. So you'll notice that there are other little branches all over the place. Other nephrons would be attached there. So the collecting duct is not unique to one nephron. It's a spot where several nephrons are connected. It's where the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule of each nephron, is attached. The collecting ducts all connect together inside the kidney, so internally, and they form the renal pelvis, which is the hollow cavity in the center. So the urine that is being produced in each nephron flows there.